It was my grandfather's funeral, a solemn occasion where everyone had gathered to honor and remember him. The air was heavy with grief, and the atmosphere was somber, just as people were reflecting on the life he had lived. My father did something completely unexpected. He stood up boldly in front of everyone and, with a smirk on his face, made an announcement that left the room in stunned silence. "I've decided to remarry," he declared, his voice filled with an odd sense of pride. "This time, to someone younger and more beautiful. Isn't that right, Julia?" Julia, one of his young employees, stood beside him, her face lighting up with amusement. She clung to his arm as if this moment was meant to be celebrated, oblivious to the inappropriateness of the setting. As I watched, I felt my stomach turn. How could he say such a thing on the day we were supposed to mourn my grandfather? Aunt Teresa, always the strong and caring one, saw my distress. She gently wrapped her arms around me and whispered, "Emily, you'll come live with us. Don't worry about child support, it won't be necessary." That day marked a major turning point in my life. Moving in with Aunt Teresa and her husband, Dennis, felt like a fresh start. They welcomed me with open arms, treating me like their own child. Their home was warm, filled with kindness and stability, something I had never truly experienced with my father. 2 months later, my father reached out, perhaps wanting to mend things, but I had already made up my mind. When he called, I told him firmly, "The only dad I recognize is Dennis." He protested, pleaded, even grew angry, but I didn't waver. I was ready to move on from his shadow and build a life where I didn't have to feel like an afterthought. I'm Emily Osmond, a 15-year-old girl who enjoys the simple pleasures of life, like middle school and the freedom of being an only child. My mom was my rock, a kind, loving woman who always put me first. We shared a close bond, and our weekend shopping trips were something I always looked forward to. My biological father, on the other hand, had never truly been there for me. He was distant and cold, always putting his own desires before his responsibilities. I often wondered why my mother had chosen him, and as I grew older, I found myself understanding her less and less. Despite my father's failures, I never lost my belief in love and family. Aunt Teresa and Dennis showed me what a real partnership looked like. They couldn't have children due to Dennis's past illness, but they treated me as if I were their own. Their love, which had overcome so many obstacles, proved to me that the right people could create a strong and happy family, no matter what challenges they faced. Even though I had found stability with them, my father still managed to bring chaos. He often spoke cruelly about Dennis, mocking him for not being able to have children and accusing him of marrying into money. These remarks only deepened my dislike for him, and I vowed that I would never grow up to be like him. One memorable event that truly exposed his character happened when I started school. My grandparents, who owned several businesses and were highly respected in the community, threw a large celebration for me. My mom, Aunt Teresa, and Dennis all played major roles in running the family business, while my father was just an ordinary employee in one of the companies. Even as a child, I found that strange. Later, I learned that he wasn't given a higher position because no one trusted him with more responsibility. At the party, my father made a joke in front of my grandfather, suggesting he should be given his own company to run. The cheerful mood in the room quickly turned tense. Undeterred, he continued, hinting that the roles in the family business should be switched so that he could have more control. My mom calmly shut down the conversation, but my father, who had been drinking, raised his voice, ranting about how unfair it was that he had to remain just an employee. My grandfather quickly stepped in, reminding him why he wasn't trusted with more power. Years ago, my father had an affair with a client's daughter, a scandal that nearly destroyed the family business. The client had been so furious that he threatened to sever all ties with them. Even though this incident had happened over a decade ago, my grandfather made it clear that past actions had consequences. My father protested, claiming that it was ancient history and should be forgotten, but no one in the family saw it that way. As the argument escalated, my mom gracefully ended it by refusing to engage. My father, frustrated and humiliated, drained his drink and stormed out, muttering a half-hearted apology for ruining the night. My grandfather reassured me, placing a gentle hand on my head, reminding me that my father's actions were not my burden to carry. Despite my father's outburst, the night continued, and I received thoughtful gifts that lifted my spirits. My grandparents gave me an electronic dictionary, my mom got me a book voucher, and Aunt Teresa and Dennis surprised me with the sneakers I had been wanting. Their kindness overshadowed my father's negativity. A few months later, Aunt Teresa and Dennis planned a summer vacation abroad, perfectly timed with my mom's business trip, expecting my father to make a fuss. I was surprised when he actually supported the idea, claiming he also had a work trip at the same time. Something about his enthusiasm didn't sit right with me, but I didn't dwell on it. I was too excited for the vacation. The trip was magical, stunning sights, delicious food, and experiences that felt like a dream. One afternoon, while enjoying tea and cake on a terrace, we were suddenly met with a shocking sight. My father was there, dressed in an aloha shirt, looking cozy with a young woman. My heart sank. This wasn't new. My father's infidelity had always cast a shadow over my family, and time after time, I had been forced to accept it. Teresa, furious, was ready to confront him, but I suggested a different approach. We took a photo and sent it to my mom, bracing ourselves for her response. Little did I know, what happened next would change my life forever. Shortly after, I received the news that shattered my world. My mom had passed away unexpectedly. The weight of that moment crushed me, and everything that had happened before suddenly felt insignificant in comparison. Nothing would ever be the same again. I could see right through my father's manipulations and the shallow nature of his affection, which seemed more about financial gain than genuine care. He acted like he was still part of our family, but in reality, he was only clinging to the past because he had no other options left. Even though I understood the legalities and finality of my parents' divorce, my father refused to accept reality. He tried to argue that my mom still loved him, but when my grandfather and I laughed at the absurdity of his claim, frustration crept onto his face. He was deluded, unable to grasp that my mom had been the one to file for divorce. The realization shattered him, and behind closed doors, he broke down, struggling to comprehend how everything had come to this. He had underestimated my mother's strength and the depth of her resolve to free herself from his toxic grip. It was another affair that finally pushed her to make the decision. The moment she discovered his latest betrayal during our coincidental trip abroad, she had been done. Now, he was left weeping, asking why she would abandon him despite his flaws. His regret, however, felt empty. It wasn't about losing her, it was about losing the life he had taken for granted. Security had to step in and remove him from the premises as he tried to resist, still unable to accept the weight of his actions. After the ordeal, my grandfather and I sat together, reflecting on what my mom had ever seen in him. Without hesitation, he involved the company lawyer and arranged for a restraining order against my father, ensuring that our family would never have to deal with his outbursts again. For a while, I tried to find solace in my daily life. Aunt Teresa took me shopping, hoping to lift my spirits, but my father had a way of creeping back into my world, refusing to let me move on. One afternoon, as we exited a department store, he appeared out of nowhere. His unkempt, disheveled state startled me. His clothes were dirty, his face gaunt. He was a shell of his former self, and the sight was almost pitiful. "I need money," he muttered, his voice laced with desperation. I stood frozen, staring at him in disbelief. The once arrogant man who had mocked others for their misfortunes was now begging on the streets. He confessed that Julia had left him, taking with her the life of comfort he had hoped for. Now, he had nothing. Aunt Teresa, standing beside me, was livid. After everything he had done, he still had the audacity to ask for help. His apologies rang hollow, and though I wanted to yell at him, I bit back my anger. Instead, I simply told him the truth. He was no longer my father. "I've been legally adopted by Aunt Teresa. You have no claim over me anymore." The words seemed to hit him like a blow. His eyes widened, and for a moment, he was speechless. Then, his concern shifted. What about my inheritance? I nearly laughed at his shamelessness. Even in his lowest moment, his mind was still on money. Coldly, I clarified that he was entitled to nothing. No financial support, no favors, nothing. His entitlement had no place here anymore. He tried to argue, but I reminded him of the restraining order. Security arrived, preventing him from following us as we walked away. His cries echoed behind us, but I didn't turn back. Days later, my father was summoned to a meeting at my grandparents' house. Julia sat beside him, her nervousness palpable. Their arrogance from before was gone, replaced by fear. My grandfather, alongside our lawyer, wasted no time in explaining why they had been called. Originally, my mother's will hadn't pursued alimony or legal action against my father, but his repeated disturbances changed everything. Now, we were officially seeking damages, not just for the affair, but for the emotional distress he had caused. Julia wasn't off the hook either. Her involvement meant she, too, was being held accountable. The weight of their consequences became evident when my grandfather announced that they were being cut off completely. Both my father and Julia would be removed from the family business. Julia, in a panic, tried to negotiate. "How am I supposed to pay alimony if I don't have a job?" she whined. Her pleas fell on deaf ears. Desperate, she turned on my father, claiming he had manipulated her into the affair. Their bickering was quickly silenced by my grandfather's commanding voice. The lawyer laid out the legal documents, showing the inescapable obligations they now faced. My father hesitated, overwhelmed, but then Dennis spoke, his words filled not with anger, but with quiet, overwhelming disappointment. He didn't need to yell, his mere presence made my father shrink into himself. And so, my father signed the papers, sealing his fate. His departure was marked by rumors of him borrowing from dangerous sources to cover his debts. Eventually, he disappeared altogether, choosing to run from his responsibilities rather than face them. And honestly, I wasn't surprised. With him gone, I focused on my real family, the ones who had always been there for me. Teresa and Dennis truly became my parents in every sense of the word. They loved me, guided me, and ensured that my mother's memory was honored in every small way. Their unwavering devotion showed me that love, when real, could withstand any hardship. Despite everything, I still believed in love and family, not because of where I came from, but because of the people who raised me.